I'm John Duval. This is the Scriptural Way Bible Study.
Lord, we come before Thee.
The Scriptural Way Bible Study is brought to you by the Seminole Point Church of Christ, located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Point Church of Christ, I would like to thank you for your interest in spiritual matters. Now, let's take our Bibles and seek the Scriptural Way. Good evening. I'm John Duval.
And I'm Dale Decker.
And I'm John Hall.
Welcome to another study, another broadcast of the Scriptural Way. The Scriptural Way broadcast is brought to you by the Seminole Point Church of Christ, located in Oklahoma City. When we come together for this time period, it is for the express purpose of studying the Word of God, to see what His Word has to say, and to seek the Scriptural way in all things. How are you gentlemen doing this evening?
You know, John, I'm doing great, and I'm happy to be back again tonight.
Well, it's good to have you back, Dale. It really is. John, how are you doing?
I may not be that good, but I'm doing pretty good.
I don't think anyone's as good as Dale. You come visit with us and come up to Mr. Dale and say, how are you doing? He says, I'm
Wonderful.
That's right.
Well, I didn't have to come to the building this morning and shovel snow.
You know, that was a very big blessing on our part.
It was.
It was. Well, let's begin with our study. Or just before we begin with our study, let me remind you of a couple things. If you're watching this through scripturalway.org, you'll notice below the viewing window two particular options you can click on. One will open up a little form that will let you submit a question or comment to us. The second one will take you to our chat room. And if you want to do that, simply click on it. And if you have a Ustream account, you can log in with your Ustream username. If you don't, that's fine. The system will assign you a generic name. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit them to us through that as well. John is over there, and I have modified the page for him so that he gets to look at a big chat window. So hopefully it'll be easier to keep check of all the chat.
My eyes, thank you.
You're more than welcome. And so John will be monitoring that. Please feel free to discuss things of the subject nature that we'll be looking at tonight. And I'll be more than happy to introduce them into the course of our study. One thing to note, John, and you might want to mention this a little bit later, if you step into the chat room, please tell us where you're from and give us your name so that when John is relaying the comments, he might be able to associate a name with some of the comments as well. Last week, we were real close to the end of Lesson 1, so we're going to take a few minutes this evening and finish up that lesson. That lesson was entitled, Are You a Partaker of the Divine Nature? And we were looking in the last section of that study, and the section titled was, Through These Precious Promises, One Become Partakers of the Divine Nature. And one of the things we looked at last week in going through this particular section is we showed how a Christian can become a partaker of God's divine nature. And we show that you have to become a child of God. You have to be born again through the Word of God. You have to put on the new man. You have to allow that new man to be renewed in knowledge according to the image of Him who created him. And then we showed that you have to escape the corruption that is in the world, according to 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. Then we took a few minutes right at the end of last week's broadcast to give some consideration to what others would and what you might consider to be characteristics of the divine nature of God. After we stepped through that, we found ourselves at the end of the broadcast last week looking at the final portion of the lesson. So what we're going to do now is to basically sum up the attributes of the divine nature with a singular statement, and that is this: God is holy. And here's what's amazing about it. If God is holy, then we can be partakers of the divine nature because we too can be holy. Isn't that right, Dale?
Exactly right. We are to be holy as well. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16 says, But as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, Be holy, for I am holy. For they indeed for a few days chastened us, as seemed best to them, but He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness, according to Hebrews 12, verse 10. So obviously we might be partakers of his holiness if we are holy.
I think that's a very important point to understand, that we can be holy. Now, an individual who's not yet a Christian, he cannot. But when you become a child of God, when you become free from all your past bondage unto sin, you become sanctified. You become holy. You become set apart. And it was an interesting passage that you referenced in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 10. He makes reference there very similar to the statement that we might be partakers of the divine nature. He says that we may be partakers of his holiness. And it shows that we can do that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are to become so holy that it may be said that we are partakers of the very holiness of God. We go back and we look at 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, the very verse that we've been looking at, where it says, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. This is the elevated object at which God aims by our trials. It is not that he delights to produce pain, nor does he envy us. And he certainly would not rob us of our little comforts. Not that he needs what we prize to increase his own enjoyment and thereby, therefore, rudely takes it away, and not that he acts from caprice, or now conferring a blessing and then withdrawing that blessing without any reason. It is that God may make us more pure and holy and thus promote our own best interest.
That's absolutely right. Therefore, then, for us to be holy is to strive to be holy as God himself was holy. Now, this isn't to say that we are expected to live as deity, for we cannot, we are man. But we can strive to live in such a way that would meet with God's approval.
Absolutely.
And thereby living a holy life, surrendering, if you would, the very farthest of our beings, surrendering ourselves unto God and unto his service. And that's what we should strive for.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, go ahead, Dylan.
Well, if we do that, once a person escapes, according to 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4 that we just read, the corruption that is in this world, then he can become partakers of the divine nature of God. At that point, and only at that point, can we be holy.
That's right. And only at that point can we set apart our lives from that of the world.
Absolutely. And we can be holy as God is holy at that point.
Absolutely. But you know what? It takes determination. It takes effort to escape the corruption that is in the world. Doesn't mean that we've got to leave the world, that we've got to find some desert island, that we've got to fly to some planet or something like that. It means that in our lives we have to live above and beyond the ways of the world in order to accomplish that, being holy, truly to escape the corruption that is in the world. Well, gentlemen, any thoughts or comments on that particular lesson before we shift gears? Any from the chat room yet?
No, not yet.
All righty. Well, let's go ahead and step into our second lesson. Now, if you haven't done so yet, you'll see a link to this lesson located to the right of the viewing window. If you'd like to click on that, you can download that and print it out. It is in PDF format. And this particular lesson is a little bit shorter. I did a little bit of stripping of the lesson to make it easier for the people who are viewing to print it out. It's only 6 pages, and I'll go back and do the same process to the first lesson if you'd like to reprint that one out later. But now, let's go back to the text of 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. And Dell, if you would read that for us again, please.
I'll be glad to. Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. And that's verses 4 and 5 of 2 Peter, New King James Version.
And that's what we've just finished looking at with our previous lesson, looking at the first 4 verses there, talking about the great and precious promises and how that we can become partakers of the divine nature. But now we bring ourselves up to verse 5. And it's interesting, in verse 5 he says, and besides this, giving all diligence, add to our faith virtue. Now we look at this, we're looking at a very interesting exhortation, and it's based upon the premise drawn in verse 4, isn't it, Dale?
It sure is. When you look at that premise, because of the precious and exceeding great promises which are yours, Be adding on your part all diligence. Giving all translates from a remarkable Greek word occurring nowhere else in the Greek Testament and meaning literally bringing in by the side of. The term it actually indicates the comparative unimportance of man's participation in his salvation by suggesting that his part is merely contributory or brought in by the side of what God does, and yet is absolutely essential since God's part is done only on condition that man complies with his part.
You know, and I think that's something that when you step out to the religious world that oftentimes is somewhat difficult for people to understand. You know, although our part by comparison is so minuscule in what we have to do, it is yet so crucial that we do that. And so hence the idea of giving all diligence. So what we have here is, in view of the absolute necessity of man's contribution by the side of what God does, it is Peter's admonition that we with all diligence, that we make this addition within our lives. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the word diligence actually means to hasten.
To hasten.
To hasten. Exactly right. And I mean, do it with all the energy that you can put into it, and do it quickly. Put this your focus. All children of God are thus exhorted to hasten or to bring in their part, though small and insignificant compared with what God wants us to do, and what God does for us, in order that they may avail themselves of the blessings which the Father has made available to them. That in which diligence is particularly enjoined follows. And then we look at add to your faith virtue.
Let's look at that for a moment. Let's start with Hebrews 11, verse 6 for just a moment. Notice here Peter says, add to your faith. You can build nothing unless you have faith in place. You cannot grow, you cannot move anywhere towards the life of a child of God unless you first begin with faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. One might say that faith is the foundation, and faith is the source from which all other duties spring. Any thoughts? We good?
Rhonda says that God always expected all dedication, obedience, and sacrifices.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah. You know, what I think I find interesting about this too is that some might overlook sometimes is that the people being addressed here are those who are already Christians, those who had already obeyed the gospel and had turned to Jesus Christ. And here he's admonishing them to add these things and to build these things. And it's not something that you have to do before you're a Christian. It's not what you do to become a Christian. And once you become a Christian, that's not the end. You still have work to do.
That's an outstanding point. You know, a lot of the great passages, even when you look at Romans chapter 10, these passages were written to people who were already children of God, people who were already saved. And these were instructions on how they were to continue living. You know, it's the idea of belief. We don't believe one time and then obey the gospel and we're saved. We have to keep on believing after we're saved. You know, we don't one time confess the name of Christ and then not have to make the confession anymore. It is a continuation within our life. And so that's an excellent point, John, about that in application being written to Christians there. Let's talk about the word add for just a moment, though. The word add here is from a Greek word which is highly suggestive and interesting in the implications which follow from its origin. That is from where the word originally came. And the idea behind the word here originally was meant to essentially support a chorus. Now, we might think of someone who is going to donate money today to some opera, to some orchestra, some type of performance there to support it. But when the original word, and you go back a little bit deeper, is to support, maybe even sometimes to lead, maybe to help, to keep in tune, to supply or provide. Now bear in mind, we're going back to originally how the Greek word was used. And it's interesting here that he groups this, he uses that particular word add in telling us to add to our faith, if you would, to support our faith with virtue, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, in fact, what he's talking about here is the graces which adorn the Christian's character are to be chorused into a grand symphony, if you will, to the delight and pleasure of him who fashioned and made us for his own good pleasure. As we look at these verses, we'll see that there are actually 8 Christian graces, faith being the first, and that they thus form an octave or so tones. The last Christian grace obviously is love, which is an octave higher than the first being faith. When these are harmonized and played on by the divine Spirit, disharmony disappears and life's discords vanish.
I thought that was a very interesting point in the study there. And it's an interesting analogy comparing the way the word add was originally used with the fact that there are 8 graces if you count faith. Add them all together there. And how, in a musical sense, if we were talking musical sense, there are 8 notes within an octave. Let's say from C to C. And all 8 notes are played together to orchestrate many songs. And when we put these graces within our life, then it creates within us a completion, a harmony in our obedience unto our Heavenly Father. That was a really good point.
Absolutely.
Good point. Well, before we step to looking at virtue, because really we're going to jump into the idea of virtue, we need to take a brief break for just a moment. Someone asked last week, how come you can still see us whenever you hear the break there? So we're going to give you a break from having to look at us on the first 2. So bear with us for the first little message, and we will be back shortly.
Hello, I'm Ron Witt, one of the elders of the Seminole Point Church of Christ. On behalf of the elders and members of the Seminole Point Church of Christ, I would like to invite you to be our guest at any of our worship services and Bible classes. The meeting place of the Seminole Point Church of Christ is located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, zip code 73013. The Seminole Point Church of Christ meets Sunday mornings at 9:30 for Bible classes, 10:30 for worship service, and 5 p.m. for our afternoon worship service. We also have Bible classes on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. In addition to our regularly scheduled Bible classes and worship services, we also have a Bible class on Tuesday morning at 10, this live netcast at 7:30 p.m., and a ladies' Bible class which meets once a month. Whether you live in Oklahoma City area or you are traveling through Oklahoma City, we would love to have you come and be our guest. We have Bible classes for all ages. Now, let us return to our study.
And we are back. Let's talk about virtue for a few minutes. Let's look at the subject of virtue. The term virtue, that is the Greek word that is translated as virtue in the add to your faith virtue, it talks about a faith that supplies, if you would, courage. One definition applied to the Greek word there is vigor of soul or soul vigor. And it's kind of a sense of manliness, isn't it? A sense of courage. Sometimes some people say it is the moral, having the moral fiber to do what is right, moral excellence. But you have to have the courage in order to do that which is a must. And it is the meaning of this word here. So what we're going to do for the sake of this study, we're going to be calling virtue essentially courage. Calling it courage. Well, Dale, whenever we look at virtue, what are we exactly talking about here?
Well, it's interesting to note that when you look at 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5, the American Standard Translation uses the phrase, in your faith supply virtue. The idea is that no single grace will make a Christian. There's 8 graces here, just as you mentioned earlier, nor can one grace be completely added at a time. In other words, you can't get your faith and then you add virtue. Right. You work on all these together. And there has to be a blending of all the graces. However, for the sake of this study, what we're going to look at is just one grace at a time. And when we look at virtue, which, as you mentioned, we will look at it as being courage, and soul vigor, or the manliness and the determination to do that which is right. We need to look at some Old Testament scriptures and some examples, the first being Joshua.
That's right. Matter of fact, before we do that, we had submitted a question earlier for those who would like to kind of help us out in our study, and we asked for examples of people in the Bible who showed forth courage. And one of the ones that were submitted, and we will actually be talking about these a little bit later, is Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were great examples of courage. Yeah. Jacob Gwynn, who, by the way, I'll take a moment to let everybody know about this. On Thursday night at 8 o'clock, if you have the time to sit down around your computer, you can go to thevirtualbiblestudy.com. And it's the College View Church of Christ out of Columbia, Tennessee. They put on an hour-long internet-only Bible study broadcast. They've been doing it for about 4.5 years now. And so Jacob Gwynn is the son of the father, Greg Gwynn, who preaches there. And Jacob sent this through our Facebook group page. He says, here is a list that sets the bar high. Hebrews 11, verses 33 through 38. And he quoted in here, he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens, women received their dead, raised, and he just goes on and on, not Greg or Jacob, but the Hebrew writer. He goes on there with talking about just great examples of people who had courage in the face of danger. And then one more, and I'll mention this because of what we're about to talk about. Barbara submitted that Joseph was an excellent example, for he was just a young man with all the same hormones as teenagers today, yet he had courage and virtue to withstand all that he went through. He is used as a great example to our children. So let's start with him, Dale.
With Joseph or Joshua?
Joshua.
All right.
Who did I say?
You said Joseph.
Well, I will
and
start
Joseph is a great example. In fact,
is.
we just happen to list that one. So obviously our audience is very tuned in to what courage looks like in the Bible.
Absolutely. And if you have more examples we'll go through, please feel free to submit them to the chat room. You can comment to the Facebook group posting if you know anything about that. So let's look at Joshua.
Well, when Moses died, God chose Joshua to take his place. And in Joshua chapter 1, we can read the words of God to Joshua. He said, be strong and of good courage, which is exactly what we're looking at. For to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not recommended or commanded you, be strong and of good courage? Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And certainly we need to recognize that as well. God is with us wherever we go.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I like, looking at this, Dale, is reading it again and looking at the words you've underlined in this context of virtue. I don't know if I've ever looked at it this way. I think every time I've looked at passages in the Bible with the words courage and strong, I've always thought physically. I don't know if I've ever really thought to break it to where it should be and put it where it deserved to be in the spiritual courage. It's a very good verse there. Greg from Tennessee says that, and this is, I think, a point we might make later on as well, a very good point, that you clearly see in the examples of virtue or moral courage in the Bible that the real test of virtue is when times are tough, not in times of ease.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's when the waters are nice and calm, that's the good time to go fishing. but when things get really rough, that's an excellent point. And I would recommend take this passage, Joshua 1, 6 through 9, print it out in big print, hang it on your wall somewhere around your house. Although Joshua was talking to them about obedience to the law that God had given Moses, well, the same admonition would apply to us today in obedience to the law that Jesus Christ had left for us. It's just incredible. But that's not the only example of Joshua and his courage before the people there. Let's go a little bit farther and look at Joshua's latter days and what he told Israel there. And this is actually, we're going to be bringing this from Joshua 23, verses 1 through 6. He says, "Now it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, and for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them," now listen, he says, "I am old, advanced in age. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has fought for you." He says, "See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain to be an inheritance for your tribes, from the Jordan with all the nations that I have cut off, as far as the great sea westward." Then he says in verse 5, "And the Lord your God will expel them from before you and drive them out from your sight, so you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you." Now, verse 6 is what I want you to focus on now. He says, "Therefore, be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left hand." And it's interesting, Dale, that he said, be courageous to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law. A wonderful example of courage.
Absolutely.
But now, are there some New Testament examples? Does the New Testament advocate through examples the idea of virtue and courage?
Oh, sure. We go to Matthew's account of the gospel, Matthew 10, verse 28, when Jesus was talking with his disciples, he told them, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Here again, we're talking about being courageous.
It's interesting about that. He uses what would seem to be a negative approach to instill courage. In other words, don't fear man, fear God.
Exactly right.
So if you have fear, reverence for God, you're not going to fear man, therefore, and that equates to courageousness, virtue within our lives. The Apostle Paul had something to say about this, John.
Sure. Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, said, "Watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong."
It's interesting, the King James Version says, "Quit you like men, be strong." As a kid, the only way I could understand that is when a preacher said, "Now here's what this means." Quit, stop. No, it doesn't mean. Basically what they're saying in the old language of English 1611, 1769, is what we just read here. You act like men. You be brave and you be strong. And it's so amazing that people find it harder, I think, at times to be courageous spiritually than they do to be courageous outwardly. Someone can come up and threaten them with a brawl and they'll stand up and, defend themselves. But when it comes to some sort of spiritual confrontation, they run away.
Yeah. I think the Apostle Paul said it even clearer when he was talking to the church at Philippi. In Philippians, the first chapter, verses 27 and 28, he says, "Only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and not in any way terrified by your adversaries, which is to them a proof of perdition, but to you of salvation, and that from God."
I think that's a good solid passage there.
Yeah, Rhonda points out in the chat room that to be morally, spiritually courageous is truly seen in our behavior when no one else is looking. How do we behave when we think no one else knows what we are doing? And she says it is a courageous thing to do the right thing.
And I think one of the greatest examples of this is when it's 3 o'clock in your morning and your pregnant wife has asked you to go to the store and get her something, ice cream, pickles, what have you. And you pull up to this red light, and nobody's around. Nobody's around for miles. There's no headlights anywhere. And the light just sits and sits and sits. And you're tired, and you want to get home. And the temptation is to run the red light. No one's watching. They don't have a camera on this red light. You could do it and get away with it. But courage says no. Of course, that's a real minor example, obviously, compared to so many other greater ones.
Right.
So, well, let's ask a question now. When do we need courage as a child of God? This goes back to what Greg commented on a while ago. When it's easy, when everything is going good, when we come together for worship services and we're around a bunch of other Christians, well, it's easy to be courageous. You got an army rally cry going on there. Everybody, we're all standing for the right thing. But it's when we step away. And so let's talk about some instances when we would need courage as children of God there. What would be a first one, Dale?
Well, certainly when we're in the minority, we may be with a group of friends at a movie theater or at the mall or maybe in school, and we're the only Christian around. All of our friends are non-Christians. It's easy to allow ourselves to be influenced by the majority if we lack courage. And for that reason, Jesus made a statement in Matthew, the 18th chapter, verse 20. He said, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them." And we always have to keep in mind that Jesus is with us. A Christian must always recognize that the majority will usually be wrong. And it's the minority, it's the remnant. And God said there will always be a remnant of Christians that will keep the church strong. Most of the cities of biblical time had walls around them to protect them from their enemies. They had 2 types of gates for entry into the city. The wide gates opened into the main roads or streets in the city. But there were also some straight and narrow gates that led into the city. Few travelers found these straight and narrow gates, and few travelers entered these gates. Finding them was worth the effort, though, because they led directly to the part of the city that travelers desired most. And it took time and effort and courage to search for these gates. But it was well worth the effort. And for that reason, Jesus made a statement in Matthew, the 7th chapter, verses 13 and 14, John.
Jesus says in Matthew 7, verse 13 to 14, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it."
Peter's a negative example, but when we were looking at this, Peter came to mind. Remember, Paul had to rebuke him, had to confront him in Galatians chapter 2 there, verse 11. Because Peter, when he was around a bunch of Jews of the circumcision, he played the part of a hypocrite and excused himself from the company of Gentiles that he was currently with. Here again, the minority should have stood up. And he, in this case in point, did not do that. Well, we've got to take another break here, so bear with us for just a moment. We've got one more break, and then we'll proceed with our study. And when we come back, we're going to look at some examples of individuals who had courage when they were in the minority. So join us, stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Dale Decker. I am one of 4 elders here at Seminole Point Church of Christ. We are very fortunate to have a Bible-loving group of Christians here at Seminole. We have 7 deacons that work very hard in making sure that those things that are not directly related with the teaching and preaching of God's Word are done. This allows the elders to focus on feeding the congregation by making sure that the purity of the Word is maintained. Our Bible class teachers are second to none. We have Bible classes for all age groups. We teach Bible things by Bible ways. Our goal is heaven, and we make every effort to ensure that the Word of God is taught at every age group. We hope that you will come and check us out. You will find that we are a very friendly and loving congregation. We are located at 16,300 May Avenue in Oklahoma City. And now back to our study.
And we're back. John, is there anything from the chat room that we need to go ahead and let's go ahead and bring to attention, and then?
Sure, we got one comment there. Daniel chapter 1 verse 8 is mentioned, where it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart," and the comment here is that Daniel, as well as other God-fearing people of the Bible, had their purpose in the right place. They did not wait to take a survey to see what to do.
Absolutely. And we'll look at Daniel a little bit later in the lesson, so that's a very good point there. Well, let's look at Joshua and Caleb as 2 great examples of individuals who stood firm with courage when everybody else was against them. In order to consider this story, let's kind of lay the groundwork for it. Here the children of Israel had been roaming in the wilderness for 40 years. No, not yet. They just began, hadn't
That's
they?
right.
I want to make sure you were paying attention.
They hadn't
Dale.
even started yet.
That's right, hadn't even started. So anyway, they come up to the land of Canaan. And Rhonda's laughing in there. I just know she is. So, anyway, they come up to the land of Canaan, and they send 12 spies in, one from each tribe. And the spies have got to go and spy out the land and come back, and one from each tribe come back, and they've got to give a report. So when they come back to give the report, there was a minority and a majority, and two opposing views there. So let's look at that, and we're looking in Numbers chapter 13, verses 26 through 33. And actually, let's jump down a little bit there. Well, let's go ahead and start with verse 33, Dale, if you want to, or 26, if you want to read that. And
Yeah, John, this is one of my favorite stories of the Bible, because when you think about this, we learn in the Old Testament that strength is not always with the majority.
Yeah.
And God told the children of Israel this very thing in Leviticus 26 chapter verses 7 and 8. He said, 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. Well, in this story of the 12 spies, every one of them was a leader of their tribe.
Yeah.
So you would expect that every one of them should have courage, but only 2 had the courage. And that's what we read here in Numbers the 13th chapter, beginning at verse 26. It says, Now they departed and come back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. Well, boy, these people were sure pessimistic here, weren't they? But then Caleb stood up in verse 30 and quieted the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight.
You know what's interesting is, my little slip up a while ago was saying that they'd been in the wilderness for 40 years. As was pointed out, they had just begun. Now, the significance of that was this. It was essentially yesterday that God had brought the 10 plagues on Egypt. It was yesterday that God had led them out of Egypt. It was just yesterday that he had parted the sea and delivered them safely. It was just yesterday that he began to provide them and take care of them, provide for them and take care of them. So it wasn't like it was 40 years in the wilderness and they had kind of forgot about what God had done for them. This was fresh. And here they go, cowering. 10 spies. And everybody
10
else
leaders.
listening to them. That's right, 10 leaders. Well, let's look now at Numbers 14. And John, if you want to read 6 through 9. And let's look at Joshua's statement to the people here.
Sure. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them.
You know what's interesting about that, and we kind of got this out of order a little bit, but earlier we read from a Joshua who was an old man, telling the people to be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law. And it's no surprise, because you go back to Joshua who was young, 40 years younger, at least 40 years younger, okay? And here he is telling them essentially the same thing. Don't rebel against the Lord. He will lead us in, and we can take that land. Just amazing story. Amazing. Well, let's consider another example of the minority. And if you haven't guessed Gideon and 300, this is the point you say, yeah, That's another good example of the minority facing the majority. Let's look at that for a moment, Dale.
Yeah, this is another fascinating story where they actually started out with 32,000 men. We've been studying this on Tuesday morning Bible class. Yeah. And if you get a chance to tune in on Tuesday morning, feel free to do that as well. But Gideon, God came to him and told him that he had plans for him to conquer a nation. And he said, I want you to reduce the number of men to a point that you cannot take credit yourself, but that the credit will go to me, i.e. God. And Gideon and his men demonstrated great courage because they knew that God was with them. And we look at Judges, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 12, and it says, Then Zerubbabel, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, My own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, This one shall go with you, the same shall go with you. And of whomever I say to you, This one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, Every one who laps from the water with his tongue, as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, every one who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then the Lord said to Gideon, By the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number as the sand by the seashore in multitude.
You know, it's kind of a lengthy reading there, 1 through 12, but there's so many important elements of the story that brings home to us the fact that God was going to provide for them, that God was going to deliver them, and it was going to be he and not man that would do that. So very good lesson there with that, Gideon and the 300. Any comments, John?
The only one that kind of goes back and helps wrap this up a little bit, talking about the minority standing for the right here, was earlier Greg had mentioned that we don't know how many young Hebrews have been taken in the group with Daniel and his three friends, but it certainly implies that they were in the minority, yet they courageously did the right thing.
That's a good point. And that would be a good spot to put Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would definitely fit within the minority example as well. Well, let's move on to another time within our lives where we are going to have that moral courage, virtue, in order to be able to stand up. And that is, we need courage when civil laws conflict with God's law. Now, God has quite clearly, through the writings of the Apostle Paul, through the inspired writings, he said, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. Now, this was written during a time period where they were under the Roman leadership. And it was a corrupt government. And it was a harsh government. And Paul was telling Christians to be subject unto them. The thing is, though, he doesn't say be subject to the Roman authority. He says let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. So no matter where we live, we must make certain that we obey the civil laws of the land, unless they conflict with the law of God. And at that moment, we have to choose God, of course, over the law of the land. Let's look at a couple examples here. If you thought of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that is a great example of someone who withstood the law of the land because of what God required of them. In this particular story, you've got three men. They refused to worship the idols of Nebuchadnezzar. They refused to bow down. So let's go ahead and read their story there in Daniel 3, beginning there in verse 14 there. He says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? If you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Now verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." Verse 18, "But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." Now, you know what? That's a bold statement. To be able to say to a king, to one who holds the very life within your hands, say, do what you want. We are going to serve our God. And understandably, if you think about it from Nebuchadnezzar's standpoint, he was full of fury. And the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he spoke and commanded that they heat the fire 7 times more than it was usually heated. And we know the rest of that story, do we not?
We know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fiery furnace, there was actually 4 people in there, not 3. And so the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they chose to serve God, they had that courage, even though they were in the minority, and recognizing that they could not follow the laws of the civil land because it contradicted God's law, they were spared.
Absolutely, absolutely. Before we go on to another example of this, we've got one more brief message. We will be right back. And gentlemen, they've got to watch us through this message, I think. Let's see. In his letter to Timothy, the Apostle Paul wrote, "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instructions in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work." The Lord, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, gave us everything we need to live righteously before him. The source of this wellspring of spiritual nutrition is the Bible, the Word of God. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, we read of the essential graces needed in every Christian's life. Beginning with faith, Peter tells us to add virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love to our lives. The only way we can make the necessary additions is by completely relying upon and following all Scriptures as God has given to us. When we add these graces to our lives, we will be fruitful in our knowledge of Jesus Christ. We will bear in our minds the death of Jesus Christ, which made possible the forgiveness of our sins. Let us all take that which God has so graciously given us and be even more diligent to make our call and election sure. If we will do these things, then we will never stumble. Now, let us return to our study. Welcome back. Well, let's look at one more example under those who had to have courage during while they were facing the government. And this fellow, of course, is Daniel, right up there with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, in this story, Adele, what was it that Daniel had chosen to do that the king had forbade him from doing?
Well, the king forbid Daniel from praying. In fact, if he was going to pray, he had to pray to the king's gods, if you will. But Daniel chose to pray to God, and he continued to pray to God 3 times a day, as was his standard procedures throughout the day. Interesting enough, he didn't do this in a closet. He did it openly. because he loved God. He was courageous enough that he was going to serve his God, and he was not going to allow any man to stop him from serving. So the story is in Daniel, the 6th chapter, verses 7 through 13. But if you begin at verse 11, it says, Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. As a result, the king had no choice but to throw Daniel into the lion's den.
Right.
But God closed the mouths of the lions, and Daniel was spared because of his courage to serve God rather than man.
Delivered them through it.
Exactly right.
I think it's interesting that both these points seem to get to both sides a little bit, where Rhonda had mentioned when nobody's watching, or at least when we're not specifically under the struggle. But then they were definitely under the struggle when they saw where they were about to go, and they could have easily at that point caved in and given in to the king at that point. Said, okay, yeah. I give. But they didn't. They stayed strong, even in both the times when it really wasn't being pressed upon them just yet, and when it was being pressed upon them.
Well, we see this in the apostles, don't we?
Exactly.
Yeah, let's look there at, and if you would, John, want to read Acts 4, 19 through 20 there.
Acts 4, 19 through 20. But Peter and John answered and said to them, Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. For we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard.
It's interesting, they were being challenged by the Jewish leadership. Now, these people professed to believe in Jehovah God, to believe in Yahweh. And they insisted that Jehovah God's law be followed. So it makes sense that Peter and John would say, you decide whether or not you think it's right that we should listen to God more than you. What would be your answer to that question, essentially? And their answer should have been, well, you got to listen to God. But he says, for we cannot but speak the things that we have seen and heard. And that should be the statement behind every single Christian's life. In everything that we face and everything that we do, we should always be willing to say, for we cannot but speak the things that we have seen and heard. We cannot but do the things that the Lord has told us to do through his word. Just so much the way that we are to be living our lives. Well, let's look at one more instance in tonight's lesson as far as time will permit, and we'll continue it, of course, next Tuesday night. We're going to look at another instance where we need courage within our lives, and that is we need to have godly courage when we are under severe temptation. Severe temptation. James has a good comment about this in James 1, verse 12. What is that, Dale?
Yeah, he says, Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Christians may have many temptations. Even Peter made that comment in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6. He said, In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials.
That's, when we look at that, we're talking about Christians enduring many things that are fitted or that will try their faith. And we're not talking about, some of these may be your hot water heater busting at 3 o'clock in the morning type trials. But a lot of these are going to be the temptations that we face to go against God. And no matter how difficult our life may become, no matter how challenging our life may become, we must always be willing to have courage. John, any thoughts or comments there?
Not on this point.
Okay.
We missed a couple from the last point, but I was letting you move on.
Oh, do we really? Okay. The one good thing about following the chat room is that if we don't get every point into our discussion, you have it there within your own discussion. And so it's kind of like a secondary study going on there. And I think that can be quite beneficial. But let's look at an example of this. And this goes back to one that Barbara had mentioned on our Facebook group page when she mentioned Joseph. Now we're up to Joseph there. He is a beautiful example of someone, an excellent example even, of someone who chose not to succumb to the temptations of a beautiful woman who desired to seduce him. Let's look at that Genesis 39, verses 7 through 9. We'll do this real briefly. He says, "And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife," that's Potiphar's wife now, "cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?'" You know, we need to teach our young people that last phrase. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? You know, Jesus, when he was being tempted, he would say, "It is written." And that's a good policy to have there. Tell people, no, the Bible says it's wrong. But how about this one? How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Just amazing, isn't it? Just amazing. Well, go ahead, John.
Some good comments here from Jacob and concerning some encouragement for us as we're going through these temptations. It says a few things that will give us courage in temptations are given in 1 Corinthians 10:13, where it says, "There hath no temptation overtaken you, but as such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make the way to escape, that you may be able to bear it." So it says that we're not going through something that is isolated to us. Others have had to go through similar things. God will be with us and help us. We can escape. These things will give us courage.
Absolutely. So many people, you'll hear them say, "Well, y'all just don't know what I'm going through. Nobody knows what I am going through." Well, they may not know the particulars of your life, but I guarantee you someone has gone through the same thing you're going through. God will not let us be tempted beyond what we're able to bear. That's an excellent point. Thank you, Jacob. Excellent point. All right, any other thoughts or comments up until this point, gentlemen?
Sometimes temptations that we don't often think about are the temptations of sickness or poverty or persecution. And this is what we go through today. And if we don't have the courage to accept that God has a purpose in everything that takes place, then we might yield to those temptations. We might begin to blame God for the situations that we're in.
That's true. That's true. You know, you mentioned poverty there. Many times we don't think about poverty coming upon us because of our Christianity. There's an explanation. I'm going to share this with you, and then I'll leave it up to you to go research it for further study, and I'll do the same thing. But if memory serves, from one of the books I was studying on the book of Revelation, the mark of the beast everybody talks about, one explanation that I read was quite interesting. It was this: Christians of the first century there, when the Roman Empire really began to persecute them, the people of the Roman Empire were required to wear a mark, like a mark of Caesar or something. And if they were willing to wear the mark, then they could do trade. They could buy and they could sell. But if they were unwilling to wear the mark of Caesar, showing that they worshiped Caesar, then they were limited. They could not buy and sell. So therefore, when you look at that particular case in point, you find Christians suffering because they were unwilling to yield to the pressures of the Roman government. And I thought it sounded like a pretty good explanation to that passage. Not one that everybody would agree with. But it shows, though, and whether that is a very accurate explanation or not, it does show, though, history shows us, that Christians were persecuted because of their faith and are persecuted today in various countries throughout this world because of their faith. And they may go through times of poverty very specifically because of their faith. And they must not yield. They must not yield a moment. Any other thoughts?
We got a good comment here that was made a few minutes ago. You know, when you think about Peter, he was qualified, especially in this area of temptation, to, as he looked back at his life, where he may have had some struggles.
True.
Mentioned here that says, isn't it noteworthy that this same Peter in Acts 4 is the one who, after he put up his sword, ended up denying even knowing Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed.
Absolutely.
So he faced some temptations, and he succumbed to those temptations, and I think he's someone who can empathize with those that may have temptations to go through.
Well, when you read 1st and 2nd Peter, you read the words of a man that speaks wisely from wisdom, lessons learned. I know he was inspired, but a lot of these lessons he learned the hard way. So, well, we're going to have to pull the study to a close tonight. We've reached the end of our hour. We will plan to pick up with another example of when we will need courage within our lives next Tuesday evening. I want to thank you so much for your interest in spiritual matters. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your Tuesday evening to sit down around your computer and to join us in this study. It is always a great moment of edification, if you would, admonition to us to see others saying, you know what, I want to sit down and study with you. And for those who have been participating in the chat, I want you to know that, again, we welcome your input. One of the things about putting three people together for a discussion like this is you've got three minds, but even three minds tend to stumble from time to time. And the more folks who are in the chat room, the more filling the discussion can be, the more information we can bring out there. So I want you to know it is our pleasure. If you are living in the Oklahoma City area or you find that you're going to be traveling through, why don't you come see us? The Seminole Point Church of Christ, as you saw earlier, and if you'll look at Seminole Point, pointe.org, or click on the link at the top of the scripturalway.org website, you'll find the Seminole Point's website, and you'll find our times of service. We're located at 16300 North May Avenue, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. If you're using a GPS or MapQuest, punch in 73013, and it'll bring you right to the building. Look at our times of service. We'd love for you to come and be our guest. Come and if you live in the Oklahoma City area and you want to come join us on a Tuesday night, we have chairs in the classroom where we're doing this. We'd be more than happy to welcome you to come in and sit down. And might even give you a microphone if you have a comment or two that you would like to make. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, our Twitter handle is at Scriptural Way. You'll see that on our website. We do have a Facebook group as well. You'll see that link as well. Gentlemen, any other thoughts or comments we need to bring up this evening?
Been a good night.
It has been a good night, a good discussion. We'll continue this again next week. Thank you so much again for your interest in spiritual matters, and please continue to seek the Scriptural Way. That is the path that will lead to eternity with God in heaven. Thank you.